Horror story. Title: The Emerging Shadows. Main story: Carl and Sabrina had always dreamed of living in the countryside, surrounded by nothing but the peace and quiet of nature. So when they stumbled upon a charming old house for sale, they couldn't resist the opportunity to make their dreams a reality. They packed up their belongings, said goodbye to their city lives, and moved to the countryside. At first, everything was perfect. They spent their days exploring the nearby forests and meadows, and their evenings cozying up by the fire. But one day, something changed. Carl was working in his home office, tinkering away at his computer, when he heard a faint whisper. At first, he thought he was imagining things. But as the days went by, the whispers grew louder, until they were unmistakable. Sabrina heard them too, and together they tried to ignore them, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, as they were getting ready for bed, they heard a strange sound coming from the attic. It sounded like scratching, or maybe even footsteps. Carl grabbed a flashlight, and they cautiously made their way up the stairs. As they entered the attic, they were greeted by a cold draft, and a strange mist that seemed to be emanating from the shadows. Suddenly, the mist coalesced into a figure, a ghastly apparition that seemed to be made entirely of smoke and darkness. Sabrina screamed and backed away, but Carl stood his ground, shining his flashlight at the figure. The apparition spoke, its voice hollow and chilling. "Leave this house," it hissed. "Leave now, or face the consequences." Carl and Sabrina tried to run, but the house seemed to have a will of its own. Doors slammed shut behind them, and windows rattled in their frames. They were trapped. The apparition followed them, hovering just inches from their faces, its cold breath sending shivers down their spines. As they stumbled down the stairs, they saw other things emerging from the shadows. Ghostly hands reaching out to grab them, faces peering out from behind curtains. The house had come alive, and it was hungry. Carl and Sabrina fought their way through the house, but every room seemed to be filled with a new terror. In one room, they found themselves trapped in a maze of mirrors, where their reflections seemed to be distorted and evil. In another, they stumbled upon a room filled with cobwebs, where spiders the size of cats scurried across the walls. Just when they thought they were going to be consumed by the house, they found a door they hadn't seen before. It was made of solid oak, and seemed to glow with a strange energy. They pushed it open, and stepped through. On the other side, they found themselves in a room unlike any they had ever seen. The walls were covered in glowing runes, and the air hummed with a strange magic. In the center of the room, there was a table with a book on it, a book that seemed to be calling to them. As they approached the book, they heard a voice behind them. "Welcome," it said. They turned around, and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was an old man, dressed in robes that seemed to be made of stars. He smiled at them, and gestured for them to sit down. The old man told them a story about the house they had bought. He told them that it had been cursed, many years ago, by a witch who had been wronged by its previous owners. The curse had caused the house to come alive, and it had been feeding on the souls of its inhabitants ever since. But there was hope, the old man told them. He explained that the book in front of them was a grimoire, containing the spells necessary to break the curse. Carl and Sabrina were hesitant, but desperate to escape the nightmare they had found themselves in. The old man handed them the book, and instructed them to perform the ritual described within. The ritual was intricate, and required a variety of ingredients that the couple had never heard of. But they were determined, and spent the next few hours gathering the necessary materials from around the house. As they worked, they heard the whispers and footsteps growing louder, and knew that time was running out. Finally, they were ready. They stood in the center of the glowing room, following the instructions in the grimoire as best they could. They chanted the incantations, and sprinkled the ingredients in the correct order. The air around them grew thick with magic, and they felt something shifting in the house. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The whispers and footsteps stopped, and the air grew still. Carl and Sabrina looked around, and saw that the house was back to normal. The ghostly apparition was gone, and the cobwebs had vanished. They breathed a sigh of relief and collapsed onto the floor. As they caught their breath, they heard a knock at the door. It was the old man, come to check on them. He smiled at them and congratulated them on breaking the curse. He explained that he had been watching the house for many years, waiting for someone to come along who could lift the curse. He thanked them for their bravery and left. Carl and Sabrina were exhausted, but relieved. They knew that they had narrowly escaped a terrible fate, and that they would never forget the horror they had experienced in that old house. But they also knew that they had each other, and that they would always be there to support each other through anything, even a haunted house in the countryside. The next day, Carl and Sabrina left the old house and drove back to their home in California. They were both grateful to be back in the city, surrounded by the comforting familiarity of their daily lives. But they knew that they would never forget the horror they had experienced in that haunted house. As they settled back into their routine, they received a package in the mail. It was from the old man who had helped them break the curse. Inside, they found a letter and a small box. The letter explained that the box contained a powerful amulet, which would protect them from evil spirits and curses in the future. Carl and Sabrina were skeptical, but they decided to try it out. They put the amulet on a chain and wore it around their necks, feeling a sense of security and peace wash over them. They knew that they had survived something terrible, but they also knew that they were stronger than they had ever been before. Months passed, and life went on. Carl continued to work as a computer engineer, and Sabrina continued to practice law. But they always kept the amulet close, knowing that it was a powerful reminder of their strength and resilience. One day, as they were sitting in their living room watching TV, they heard a knock at the door. Carl got up to answer it, but when he opened the door, he found nobody there. Confused, he looked around, but the street was empty. As he turned to go back inside, he heard a faint whisper. It sounded like the ghostly voice that had haunted them in the old house. But this time, it was different. This time, it was saying something that chilled him to the bone. "Carl Gore," it whispered. "I'm still here." Carl froze, feeling a sense of dread wash over him. He turned to Sabrina, who was watching him with concern. She saw the fear in his eyes, and knew that something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked. Carl swallowed hard, and tried to speak. But his throat felt tight, and no words would come out. All he could do was point to the amulet around his neck. Sabrina saw the amulet, and understood. She took Carl's hand, and together, they walked back into the safety of their home. They knew that they would always be haunted by the memory of the old house, but they also knew that they were stronger than any curse or ghost that could come their way. They sat down on the couch, holding each other tight, and waited for the whispering to stop. They knew that they had each other, and that they would never have to face the horrors of the world alone. As they sat on the couch, the whispering grew louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from every corner of the room, filling their ears with a sense of dread and despair. Carl and Sabrina tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The whispering was too strong, and it seemed to be getting more and more intense with each passing moment. Suddenly, the TV flickered, and the lights went out. Carl and Sabrina looked around, feeling a sense of panic rise in their chests. They knew that they had to do something, but they didn't know what. Then, Sabrina remembered the grimoire. She ran to the bookshelf and pulled out the old book, flipping through the pages frantically until she found the section on banishing spirits. Carl watched as Sabrina read the incantation, her voice growing louder and more forceful with each word. He felt a sense of awe and fear wash over him, as he realized that his wife was capable of things he had never imagined. Finally, Sabrina finished the incantation, and the room fell silent. The whispering stopped, and the lights flickered back on. Carl and Sabrina looked around, feeling a sense of relief wash over them. But they knew that the ghostly presence was still out there, waiting for them. They didn't know how long they could hold it off, but they were determined to try. They sat on the couch, holding each other tight, and waited for the next attack. But it never came. The night passed, and the ghostly presence seemed to fade away. In the morning, Carl and Sabrina woke up feeling tired but relieved. They knew that they had survived something terrible, but they also knew that they had each other. As they got ready for work, they talked about the future. They knew that they would never forget the horror they had experienced, but they also knew that they were stronger than any curse or ghost that could come their way. Together, they walked out of their home and into the bright sunlight, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They knew that they had each other, and that they would always be there to support each other through anything. And that was the greatest protection of all. As they drove to work, Carl and Sabrina couldn't help but feel grateful for each other's presence. They were relieved that they had been able to overcome the strange and terrifying occurrences of the previous night. However, their relief was short-lived as they soon discovered that something was off. The sky was dark and foreboding, and there were no other cars on the road. They both knew that something wasn't right. Suddenly, Carl's car sputtered to a stop. They were stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no signs of civilization in sight. Sabrina started to panic, but Carl remained calm and collected. He knew that they had to think fast if they wanted to survive. As they stepped out of the car, a chill ran down their spines. The air was thick and heavy, and they could sense that they were not alone. They looked around, but they could see nothing but an endless expanse of dead trees and overgrown bushes. Suddenly, they heard a faint whispering. It was the same eerie whispering that they had heard in their home the previous night. Sabrina grabbed Carl's hand tightly, and they began to run towards what they hoped was the nearest town. As they ran, the whispering grew louder and more frantic. They could feel the presence of something behind them, but they didn't dare look back. They could hear the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer. Finally, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned gas station. They ran inside, locking the doors behind them. But they soon realized that they were not safe. The whispering was louder than ever, and the doors began to shake and rattle. They could hear the sound of something trying to force its way inside. Carl and Sabrina knew that they had to act fast. They searched the gas station for any weapons they could find and barricaded the doors. They didn't know what was coming for them, but they were determined to fight back. As they stood back to back, ready to face whatever was coming, they heard a loud banging on the roof. Suddenly, a figure crashed through the ceiling, landing on the floor with a thud. It was a grotesque creature, covered in blood and with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It lunged towards them, and they fought back with all their might. But the creature was too strong, and they soon realized that they were no match for it. Just as all hope seemed lost, a beam of light appeared, illuminating the creature. It screeched in pain and vanished into thin air. Carl and Sabrina looked up and saw a helicopter hovering above them. They were saved. As they were lifted to safety, they looked back at the gas station, knowing that they had narrowly escaped death. They held each other tightly, grateful for the bond that had helped them survive the horrors they had faced. They knew that they would never forget the terrors they had faced, but they were also confident that they could face anything together, as long as they had each other. As they flew away from the gas station, Carl and Sabrina looked down at the abandoned house they had purchased. They realized that they had made a terrible mistake by buying the house without thoroughly investigating its history. The helicopter dropped them off at the nearest police station, where they reported the incident and the strange occurrences that had been happening in their home. The police took their report seriously and sent a team to investigate the house. Days passed without any word from the police. Carl and Sabrina were growing increasingly worried, and they decided to visit the police station to get an update. When they arrived, they were met with a surprising sight. The police officers looked pale and shaken. They told Carl and Sabrina that they had found evidence of a cult that had been performing dark rituals in the house for decades. The cult had used the house as a gateway to another dimension, where they had made deals with demonic entities. The police officers explained that they had found a portal in the house, which they had sealed off. They advised Carl and Sabrina to never go back to the house, as it was still a danger to them and anyone who entered it. Carl and Sabrina were horrified by the revelation. They realized that they had narrowly escaped with their lives, and they were grateful to the police for saving them. They knew that they had to start over and find a new home, but they also knew that they would never forget the horrors they had faced. As they walked out of the police station, they held each other tightly, knowing that they had each other to rely on. They knew that they would never be able to forget the horrors they had faced, but they were confident that they would be able to face anything together, as long as they had each other. Carl and Sabrina left California, deciding that they needed a fresh start in a new state. They settled in a small town in Texas, where they found a cozy house that felt safe and peaceful. They started over and slowly put the past behind them, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They would often wake up in the middle of the night to strange noises, and they would catch glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corners of their eyes. At first, they tried to convince themselves that it was just their imagination playing tricks on them, but they soon realized that they were not alone in their new home. They knew that something was following them. One night, they woke up to find that their entire house was covered in a thick, dark fog. They could barely see their own hands in front of their faces. The whispering they had heard before was back, and it was louder and more frantic than ever. They knew that they had to get out of the house, but they couldn't find the front door. They were lost in a maze of rooms and hallways, with no way out. The whispering grew louder and more menacing, and they could hear the sound of something approaching them. Suddenly, a light appeared, and the fog started to dissipate. They could see the outline of a figure in front of them, and they realized that it was the same woman they had seen in their previous house. The woman smiled at them, and they realized that she was not there to harm them. She told them that she was a medium, and that she had been following them since their encounter with the demonic cult. She explained that they were still being targeted by the demonic entities, and that they needed to perform a ritual to protect themselves. She guided them through the ritual, and they felt a sense of calm and safety wash over them. As the ritual ended, the woman vanished into thin air. Carl and Sabrina were left standing in their living room, feeling relieved and grateful for the woman's help. They knew that they had a long road ahead of them, but they were confident that they could face anything together. From that day on, they were never bothered by the whispering or the shadowy figures again. They lived their lives in peace, and they knew that they would never forget the horrors they had faced. But they also knew that they were stronger and closer than ever, and that they could face anything together. Years passed, and Carl and Sabrina never forgot about the horrors they had faced in their previous homes. They made sure to thoroughly research any property they were interested in buying, and they always kept their guard up. Their experience had changed them, but it had also brought them closer together. They had a deeper appreciation for their relationship and for the preciousness of life. One day, they received a call from an old friend who was selling their family's beach house in California. Despite their previous experience, they were intrigued by the opportunity and decided to take a look. The moment they set foot in the house, they knew that it was different from the previous houses they had lived in. The air was fresh, the sunlight streamed in through the windows, and they felt a sense of calm wash over them. They decided to buy the house and spent many happy summers there with their family and friends. They had finally found a place that felt like home, and they knew that they would never forget the horrors they had faced, but they had also learned to appreciate the good things in life. But as the darkness of the night crept in, they heard a faint whispering in the distance. It was so faint that they weren't sure if they were imagining it or not, but it sent shivers down their spines. They shook off the feeling and tried to focus on the beauty of their surroundings, but the whispering grew louder and more insistent. They looked at each other, knowing that they couldn't ignore it any longer. They followed the sound of the whispering until they reached the basement of the house. As they descended the stairs, they could feel the temperature drop and the air thicken with an ominous presence. They saw a dark figure standing in the corner, and they knew that they were not alone. The figure turned around, revealing a face that was twisted and distorted with malice. The end.